I'm happy to play the fool to follow up my husband's gravitas. As the Dean mentioned, we are gathered here together this evening for a convocation, literally a calling together of both the native citizens of Thomas More College, the faculty, staff, and students who have been here somewhere between 1 and 30 years, and a recent invasion of strangers, an influx of aliens, freshman carpenters from California, foreign laborers from Long Island with strange accents, even a strange faculty refugee from a hostile territory to the south. Everywhere one turns on campus, there are signs of this alien invasion. Alien freshmen can be seen setting themselves down on your favorite chair in the Scholars Lounge. Gathering in your comment section, staring longingly at your last Red Bull, if you're in the men's dorm, or your kombucha, if you're in the women's dorm. Or even, horror of horrors, attracting the admirable notice of members of the upper class. There are adorable alien babies bouncing around campus, and even an alien dog performing even more alien tricks, levitating in the calf. Mr. Kaiser is even sporting an alien beard. As if that weren't enough for us change-averse Thomas morons, there are alien colors on the dorms. And I dare say if the paint chips had said sagebrush or adobe instead of Gloucester sage and Etruscan, they would still be the same dirty, buttery yellow and disgusting brown that they were before. How are we to deal with all of this alien invasion, all of this strangeness? Well, for guidance, and this is something I don't quote very often being someone who studies literature, I turn to the angelic doctor. In the Summa Theologica, the first part of the second part, question 105, article 3, Aquinas deals with the question of what to do with strangers, or as he calls them, foreigners. Man's relation with foreigners are twofold: peaceful and hostile. Now we have a choice before us, and the play also that we read for this afternoon presents a choice before us. Are we to respond with hostility, insurrection, rebellion, or peacefully? Aquinas continues, quote, if foreigners were allowed to meddle with the affairs of a nation as soon as they settled down in its midst, many dangers might occur, since the foreigners, not yet having the common good firmly at heart, might attempt something hurtful to the people. Well, here's where I think, and I hope you recognize the merry jest, the understanding of what we're experiencing as alien and foreign departs from reality. So rather than being foreigners and aliens, all of this newness, all of this strangeness, all of the wonderful people who have come to our shores are not aliens. They actually do have our common good at heart. And so they can assimilate rather rapidly. As Professor Thompson said, it's a gathering of persons in pursuit of a common love. And all of us share that. And so I think that we can dispense with that anxiety at the outset. And so I want to consider this evening a couple of considerations, since I didn't really want to talk about the play too much for a couple of reasons. One, because I didn't want to repeat what somebody else might have already said during the afternoon, but also because I didn't want to have to revise my talk as I was giving it, based on the intelligence and commentary that I received this afternoon. And some of my views on the plays have changed over the course of the conversation and the discussions. But I do want to use the play, or to look to the play, as a kind of guide for what I wish to address to you this evening. And I love the way that the play joins two of the great Englishmen whom our college cherishes, Sir Thomas More and Sir William Shakespeare. And the point of intersection between those two men is, I would argue, even though More wrote largely in Latin, the nature of words and the glory of words and the danger of words, the potential of words and the peril of words, and particularly the nature of eloquence or elevated speech. And I first wish to examine briefly the role of words in the play itself, and then also discuss the role of words in our contemporary culture. So first, the status of words in the play. I have to confess that I was made vaguely uncomfortable by what seemed to me a dichotomy presented in the play between speech on the one hand and violence on the other, between words and swords. You may have noted this. When Thomas More succeeded in quelling the rebellion through eloquence, both the common folk and the authorities are in agreement that More has indeed conquered the rabble, but with speech rather than arms. Quote, "Thou hast done more with thy good words than all they could with their weapons," and that's Dahl. And then the Lord Mayor says, quote, "Not steel, but eloquence hath wrought this good." In these juxtapositions, words are important because they can act as a helpful alternative to violence. Unrest can be quelled by speech or by force, and More, with his eloquence, is able to quell through the former. Now, it's worth remembering, and Dr. Eslin's comments reminded me of this, of the role of Lincoln, the insurrectionist, who actually is able to achieve his aims through words as well. He's able to gather the rabble that he needs through his words, through his moving speeches. So I think that this dichotomy between words and swords is actually undermined at many points by the very events of the play itself. And as we look at it, by the entire thrust of More's life. One need only think of the articles, a series of words that don't end in peace and in the quelling of unrest, but break out into violence, particularly in More's life. And obviously, this is something that Shakespeare understands. For those of you who've read Shakespeare, he's always using the metaphor of battle to comment on the nature of words. One has only to recall, for instance, Benedick's protestations regarding Beatrice taunts in Much Ado About Nothing. She speaks poniards and every word stabs. Gentlemen, I'm sure you can appreciate that line. Indeed, the immediate aftermath of More thwarting the rebellion jolts us back into the reality in which words and swords are not so dichotomous. So, and I'm thinking here of the physical knighting of More, in which he moves by a mere word from being a rather ordinary citizen to being in the inner echelons of royal power. And you can kind of imagine this happening on the stage. It's rather dramatic and rather stark. Shrewsbury comes up and says, quote, "My lord, his majesty sends loving thanks to you, your brethren, and his faithful subjects, your careful citizens. But, Master More, to you, a rougher, yet as kind salutation. A knight's creation in this knightly steel. Rise up, Sir Thomas More." This rougher yet as kind greeting unites in a single gesture the sword in the knighting ceremony and the word Sir, in the, quote, creation of More as a gentleman, Sir Thomas More. And I was surprised to see that Dr. Powers didn't draw what to me were the obvious parallels with Coriolanus. And Coriolanus, if those of you who know the play, his change from Caius Marcius to Coriolanus. And then, of course, the divesting of both of those titles by the end of the play. So I would suggest that these passages on the relationship between words and swords are a little problematic, and I think they're intended to be. It's part of that satiric undercurrent that runs throughout the play. And the passages in which More's words are privileged as quelling the riot seem to me to somewhat undermine or diminish the real power of words, the real thrust of words, the danger of words. Certainly in the equation of eloquence with mere breath, the word itself sounds insubstantial. Words are but breath. Both Shrewsbury and Palmer seem to suggest a kind of amazement that something so insignificant as words can affect such dramatic outcomes. Shrewsbury says, "We'll straight go tell his highness this good news. I'll tell him how your breath hath ransomed many a subject from sad death." And Palmer says, "Go guard them hence. A little breath well spent cheats expectation in the fairest event." So their words are equated with breath, which sort of goes out and dissipates. But it's actually worth recalling what God does with breath in Genesis. "Then the Lord God formed a man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life." So I think there's two ways of reading many of the lines in the play, one that seems to undermine the power of words and one that seems to actually suggest indirectly the incredible power and capacity of words. I think this is also raised in the scene where Lincoln is sent to the gallows, not in time for the message to come that actually Henry VIII has shown mercy. And Doll, of course, is about to be beheaded, and she gives her last words. And if you recall, when More was able to quell the rebellion, he promised them repeatedly that they would receive mercy. He repeats it 3 times. He says, "No doubt his majesty will grant it to you. There's no doubt but mercy may be found if you so seek, if you yield yourselves. No doubt what punishment you in simplicity have incurred. His highness in mercy will most graciously pardon." And they respond, "We yield and desire his highness's mercy." On the strength of More's words, instead of continuing the rebellion, they voluntarily go to prison. Now, Lincoln goes to his death because essentially they all believe at the time that More's words haven't had the power to move the king toward mercy. And Doll, in her final speech, sort of exonerates More. And she says, "I know he's an honest man, and that he promised us this, but it's okay because speech doesn't really matter. Language doesn't really have much authority or meaning." She says, "Yet I would praise his honesty much more if he had kept his word and saved our lives. But let that pass. Men are but men, and so words are but words." Now, this was kind of a striking passage to me because it seemed to be a kind of expression or an acknowledgement of the unreliability of words, a kind of cynicism almost of the nature of words. And I'm sure this time period warranted an understanding that words can be duplicitous. We need only look at one of the plotters that we talked about earlier today, Anthony Munday. who troubles me to no end when I read this play, because I read even the passages that seem to be favorable to Catholics, and I'm constantly second-guessing myself. Because here was a man who knew how to walk the walk and talk the talk so that he could inform on Catholics, so that he could inform on Edmund Campion. He was responsible for the death of many Catholics. And I know it's questionable whether or not he actually penned these words, but his hand is on these words. And so it's hard for me to reconcile that with the actual actions of his life. I was sharing one anecdote earlier with Mr. Jackson that toward the end of his life, knowing that so many individuals had been beheaded, had been drawn and quartered at his information, it was said that whenever he was at a feast and there was a leg of lamb, he would come into the feast, view the whole quartered leg, and scream and run out of the room. So presumably here was a man, by legend, with a haunted conscience for playing both sides. And so I want to take the play at face value, but when Dahl says words are but words, I have my doubts. And this seemed an incredibly modern notion to me, that words are but words, that there's no integrity to words, that all of Moore's eloquence is not to be reckoned anything except for its utility. It reminded me of a passage in another medieval work, but obviously written by a modern writer, and those of you who are seniors know that I have a special affection for Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. And you remember, those of you who've read it carefully will recall the discussion of words early on in the novel. There's a woman, Fru Ashild, who gives a lot of bad advice. And she sort of thinks people aren't going to really, that Kristin and her mother in the past aren't really going to take heed of this, but they do, and disastrous things result. And when she's confronted with this, she says, oh, those were just but words. Those were just words. But those of you who've been studying your Weaver know that ideas have consequences, but words have consequences too. And so I want to suggest that the play invites a consideration of the power and nature of words. Are they mere words? Or do words have a more serious capacity to affect results in the real world? Do they have the capacity both to move us? Richard Weaver, in his work, The Ethics of Rhetoric, says speech can move us in three ways. It can move us toward what is good, it can move us toward what is evil, or it can not move us at all. And with those three potential recognitions of the nature of words in front of us, I just want to spend a few minutes chronicling what I see are the threats to words today. And some of these are may seem very trivial, but I think they're important to put in context for you as students, as ones who study words and who ponder words and the significance of words. I would suggest, going off of the theme of aliens and strangers that the play presents, that we are in danger at this present cultural moment of becoming strangers to our own language. We're certainly becoming strangers to our own tradition. And as I hope you'll see by the end of the talk, when I begin to quote writers like Newman, this ability to understand language, to understand our tradition, on a fundamental level affects how we can understand ourselves. If language is the currency in which we can exchange thoughts with others and with ourselves, then this diminishment of the capacity of language and our understanding of words will diminish our self-understanding. And I would suggest that members of our culture who've lost that capacity for language will continue to increasingly stand mute before themselves, before others, before their very creator. And so I want to just take a few moments to consider what might be some kind of humorous, but in my view, as with most of the merry jests and more, very serious considerations of the abuse of language in our culture. So no doubt many of you have heard of this series of Shakespeare called No Fear Shakespeare. How many of you have read a No Fear Shakespeare? All right, just a couple. That's marvelous. So it's off the list of most high school and homeschooling works. But in No Fear Shakespeare, it's basically facing page. You have the original Shakespeare, and then you have the No Fear version, because of course Shakespeare is very terrifying and intimidating, and so you need the sort of pared down version that you can understand. This was just a random sampling of the No Fear Shakespeare, which is quite common to assign for most high school students, indeed today many college students. In Macbeth, at the beginning of Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 3, the witches have prophesied that Macbeth will be Thane of Cawdor, that he will be king, and then they disappear, quote, into the air, and what seemed corporeal melted as breath into the wind. And then Banquo then asks, quote, were such things here as we do speak about? Or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner? Now, the No Fear translation renders those words thus. Were these things we're talking about really here? Or are we both on drugs? Yes, Banquo. Yes, hapless high school students. We've all eaten of, quote, the insane root that takes the reason prisoner. And it is rapidly causing us not only to forget our own reason, but our common language, our rich heritage, and our very selves. We are all figuratively, if not literally, on drugs. The No Fear Shakespeare terrifies me. I also want to just mention this, something you may have heard of called the Common Core, which is neither common nor a core. So it's a gross misnomer. I had the, again, another horrifying experience of addressing the New Hampshire Board of Education earlier this summer on the problems with the language arts and literacy standards of the Common Core. So I had to carefully go through the standards for several days, which was kind of a mind-numbing experience. And the people who wrote the standards have clearly been eating of the insane root for a long, long time. Take this little bit of eloquent prose from the standards. Quote, students must be immersed in information about the world around them if they are to develop the strong general knowledge and vocabulary they need to become successful readers and be prepared for college, career, and life. Informational texts play an important part in building students' content knowledge. Further, it is vital for students to have extensive opportunities to build knowledge through texts so that they can learn independently. There's so much wrong with this passage that I don't know where to begin. And it's so eminently stupid that I'm embarrassed after the elevated remarks of those who came before me to be quoting it on such an auspicious occasion. What on earth is content knowledge? I didn't know that content was an adjective. I don't know what to build knowledge through text means. As if the works you study are just so many Lego bricks. Immersed in information. I don't know about you, but I feel like most young people are drowning in information. All of our educational effort now is directed toward not understanding language, not understanding ourselves, but in the words of the SAT redesign, quote, understanding really useful words in context. So vocabulary lists at every level of education, and this kills me. are now jettisoning beautiful words, rich words, meaningful words, words that help you understand the text we read at Thomas More College, in favor of words like hypothesis, synthesis, empirical. As the people who redesigned the SAT say, the old vocabulary was focused on words that are, quote, obscure and not widely used in college and career. These words, while interesting, often lack broad utility. Sorry, Edmund Burke. Sorry, Sir Walter Scott. My apologies to Samuel Johnson, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Hawthorne, Melville, Shakespeare, and pretty much all the authors we read here, but we simply have no use for that glut of useless words, usually descriptive adjectives, words like fatuous, insane, vulgar, imbecile, asinine. The traditional understanding of language and literature as to teach by delighting has now been supplanted by to indoctrinate by data analysis. And part of this, it's intentional. On the parts of the hapless teachers who are teaching this, they just think, someone's giving me material, I must teach it, but they're tools. I have to mention my favorite vocabulary program, which some of you may have used. I know I polled some of my writing tutorial students and they've used it, which has sadly, it's just gone. It's just gone. And this was called Wordly Wise. Anybody ever use Wordly Wise? It's been around since the year I was born. It's gone through 6 editions unchanged since then. A few years ago, they came out with Wordly Wise 3000. They're very forward-looking. And now they have Wordly Wise i3000. It's a disaster. I even went to the Christian Book Distributors website in the hopes of buying up all the old copies of Wordly Wise, not simply because I wanted to use them with my own children, but as a kind of cultural archive. So I truly take what Richard Wilbur says in his poetry, that some things are truly lost, to heart. And this is something I don't want to be lost. This vocabulary program is the joy of at least my 10-year-old son. It has a section in every lesson where you have to identify which sentence the word is used inappropriately in. This has now been replaced in the new edition by a passage of content-rich nonfiction. Well, I'd like to read content-poor nonfiction myself, but, you know, whatever. I'll read content-rich nonfiction if I have to. And then comprehension questions on the content-rich nonfiction that uses words like empirical and hypothesis. So this old Wordly Wise has this section. If you know who the character Mrs. Malaprop is, or Malapropisms, or you've read Much Ado About Nothing and you know who Dogberry is, my son howls with laughter when he goes through this section. It has sentences like this. If your dog is sick, you should take her to a veteran. She was deep and somber when we arrived, but we quickly awoke her. We distinguished the flames by throwing buckets of water on them. And then it has this great section at the end that tells you the story of words, the history of words. So somber, for instance. I just randomly turned to a volume of this last night. It's not like I studied, 12 years of Wordly Wise for this talk, sorry. But somber, S-O-M-B-E-R, is sometimes spelled somber, S-O-M-B-R-E. Both spellings are correct, although the R-E ending is preferred in England and the E-R ending preferred in the United States. The word was influenced by the Latin word umbra, meaning shade. As you know, an umbrella can be used to shade us from the sun. In Mexico, people frequently wear sombreros, broad-brimmed hats to shade their faces from the sun. If you are somber, you are sad or gloomy, or, quote, in the shade. This, fellow students and faculty members, is a common core. It is the history of our language. It unites us to other cultures, other places, other eras. It gives you a joy, a delight in the beauty of our language. So much for the Common Core. On to gas pump vocabulary. Part of the difficulty in conveying meaning through language today is the paucity of our speech. And if you don't know what the word paucity means, don't turn to Wordlywise to find out. By any cultural or linguistic register, our vocabulary is increasingly anemic. That means ill. I pondered this recently as I pumped my gas at one of those fancy high-tech gas stations. You know, the kind with the video screen that plays while you pump. So it relieves you of the burden of making eye contact or striking up a conversation with the guy filling up his car on the opposite pump. Watching the gas pump video screen, sandwiched between fevered announcements of the latest Taylor Swift video and an account of the latest sports star who knelt during the national anthem, I was treated to, quote, the word of the day. Time for the word of the day, the announcer voice announced. The word appeared on the screen in bold white letters against a fluorescent blue background. Loquacious. This is interesting, I thought. Vocabulary at the gas pump. Loquacious, the announcer continued. Wordy, talkative. Then I saw the sample sentence that appeared below the definition. I hated it when the teacher put me next to that loquacious kid. Obviously, even if this sentence didn't violate every precept of good writing you will learn at Thomas More College, which it does, and even if the sentiments weren't small-minded, which they are, it would still be an awful sentence. Is it wrong to think that culture is in the last paroxysms of decline when we have to turn to the gas pump to get our vocabulary? My last illustration is an illustration of what, it's actually kind of hopeful. Those were kind of funny and they actually depressed me. This one is kind of hopeful. It has to do with what Weaver calls the uncontested term. Richard Weaver, in his book, The Ethics of Rhetoric, has a chapter called The Spaciousness of the Old Rhetoric. And he looks at these great rhetoricians, these great orators of previous generations. And he says, why don't we have this today? And one of the reasons he comes up with, which I think is very apropos of our current situation, is that we no longer agree on uncontested terms. And if you think about that, even since Weaver's day, Weaver's writing in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, that has gotten just incredibly worse, right? So okay, we might not have agreed on patriotism, rights. Today, take a word like man, woman, marriage, baby. These are contested terms in our contemporary rhetoric. And so it's really amazing that any public figures actually say anything. Many of them don't. So I have a couple of speeches that I wanted to contrast. And the first is a speech given over the summer by the Speaker of the House in opposition to, quote, Trump care. And I'm not trying to be political here or promote a certain agenda. I'm just looking at the words and the rhetoric. Quote, if you believe in the health of well-being of the American people, So I want you to see, are there any contested terms in here? I suppose we could look at American people and think of that as a contested term, but it's repeated so many times that I doubt the author considers it. If you believe in the health and well-being of the American people, you must reject this bill before us now. It is what Trump care. Here's what it means for the American people. Here's what it means for the American people. Much has been said about policy here today and over time. Much has been said about politics. What are the politics of this? What are the politics of this? But what's really important is what this means to the American people. And they know, they're listening, they know what it means to them. It means Trump Care does. It forces family to pay higher premiums and deductibles, increasing out-of-pocket costs. Costs, less coverage. A lot of these short sentences, because we actually don't know what a complete sentence looks like anymore. Trump Care will take away health care for more than 24 million hardworking Americans, a crushing tax age. Trump Care forces Americans aged 50 to 64 to pay premiums 5 times higher than what others pay for health care coverage, no matter how healthy they are. Steals from Medicare. Steals from Medicare. Trump Care shortens the life of Medicare Trust Fund and ransacks funds that seniors depend on to get the long-term care they need. That's why it's consistent with their wither on the vine for Medicare philosophy. And then if that were not bad enough and they couldn't pass their bill because it was that bad, they moved further away from the American people. So in our zeal to move further away from the uncontested term, we end up saying nothing. Here's a speech Donald Trump gave to the Boy Scouts over the summer. American hearts are warmed every year when we read about Boy Scouts placing thousands and thousands of flags next to veterans' grave sites all across the country. By honoring our heroes, you help to ensure that their memory never, ever dies. You should take great pride in the example you set for every citizen of our country to follow. Generations of American Boy Scouts have sworn the same oath and lived according to the same law. You inherit a noble American tradition. As you embark on your lives, never cease to be proud of your values as your badge of honor. We might quarrel with that word values. What you've done, few have done before you. What you've done is incredible. What you've done is admired by all. So I want to congratulate you, Boy Scouts. Let your scouting oath guide your path from this day forward. Remember your duty, honor your history, take care of the people God puts in your life, and love and cherish your great country. There's a lot of uncontested terms in there. I want to end by suggesting a potential solution to this problem of the decay of language. And I'm looking at the potential solution. I would suggest that our language has a rich history. Every word has its own history, its own story. And as I hope I've shown you, we're in danger of losing that, of losing language potential to communicate our thoughts. And I'm not suggesting cultivating a wide and varied vocabulary for its own sake. I think there are those of you who've taken my classes know that I love authors who have a pretty limited vocabulary. I love the Icelandic saga. I would highly recommend the entire ballad tradition. Beowulf, Robert Frost. A lot can be said with very few words. And in fact, sometimes the reticence or silence is as important as the speech. But that can only happen when one is attuned to the nature of language, the power, the beauty of human speech. When Barbara Allen says, "Young man, I think you're dying," there's a world of meaning behind those words. At this college, we attempt to integrate reading and reality. So we don't read disembodied texts which shadow forth even more disembodied ideas. We don't only read about the good life, we discuss it and hopefully pursue it. We don't theorize about the relationship between art and reality. We create art. And we don't simply study the style of great authors in our writing courses, we cultivate our own style. And like Flannery O'Connor, we believe that all good writing is incarnational. We believe that form and meaning, style and substance are inseparable. And here I quote Newman. Newman takes on those who say that style, that language, is simply adornment, it's simply ornament. Quote, as if language were the hired servant, the mere mistress of reason, and not the lawful wife in her own house. He continues of those who critique writers for having artificiality in their style by saying, can they really think that Homer or Pindar or Shakespeare or Dryden or Walter Scott were accustomed to aim at diction for its own sake, instead of being inspired with their subject and pouring forth beautiful words because they had beautiful thoughts? This is surely too great a paradox to be borne. Rather, it is the fire within an author's breast which overflows in the torrent of his burning, irresistible eloquence. He says that style is not only an image of the subject, but of his mind. His language expresses not only his great thoughts, but his great self. Certainly he might use fewer words than he uses, but he fertilizes his simplest ideas and germinates into a multitude of details and prolongs the march of his sentences and sweeps round to the full diapason of his harmony as if rejoicing in his own vigor and richness of resource. A narrow critic will call it verbiage, when it really is a sort of fullness of heart. Parallel to that which makes the merry boy whistle as he walks, or the strong man, like the smith in the novel, flourish his club when there is no one to fight with. My 10-year-old who loves Worldly Wise will turn 11 next Saturday, and he said to me with great earnestness, and to the mortifying groans of his sister, if I go on campus that day, do you think the students will dote on me? Don't. I know you're all weary, and so I'll end with the word weary. Weary. For sound and sense, you can't match it. Tired, worn out, exhausted, miserable. They simply won't do. Where have ye been lately, Lord Ranald, my son? Where have ye been lately, my handsome young one? I've been to the green wood, mother, make my bed soon, for I am weary, weary hunting, and fain would lie down. When Antonio says, in sooth I know not why I am so sad, it wearies me, you say it wearies you. And Portia then comes on a few scenes later. By my troth, Nerissa, my little body is a-weary of this great world. We can't imagine the word weary being substituted for tired, exhausted, spent. I would give a great deal of tired, exhausted, useful words for one well-placed weary. As Robert Frost reminds us, the ear is the only true writer and the only true reader. I've known people who could read without hearing the sentence sounds, and they were the fastest readers. Eye readers, we call them. They can get the meaning by glances, but they're bad readers because they miss the best part of what it is a good writer puts into his work. I wouldn't be writing this at all if I didn't think it was the most important thing. Frost says elsewhere in a little little known poem on New Hampshire, and it's not his best poem. The only good tree went to mill and was made into boards. A lot of trees these days are being made into boards. At gas pumps, in schools. But at Thomas More, we want you to be trees. We want you to spend the next 1, 3, 4 years spreading your branches or changing beautiful changes, as Gerard Manley Hopkins says in his journals. Now, of course, being a tree means you have to be pruned now and again, but it means you have to have well-established roots. But because you are a tree, you can better understand the tree we exalted yesterday, the tree that Our Lady of Sorrows stood beneath on the feast we celebrate today. And then you'll be able to see Thomas More's merry jests, his wit and his wisdom, not as, quote, scoffs and mocks, as Holinshed would have it in his chronicles, but as a foretaste of the joy and delight to come, when, God willing, as Moore writes in his final letter, we may merrily meet in heaven. Thank you.